The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome. Thank you for being at today's meeting of Death with Dignity-Albany. It's very nice to see all of you. It's always hard to know how many people to expect, but I'm really delighted that you're all here. I'm Bonnie Edelstein. I'm the director of Death with Dignity-Albany. And Death with Dignity-Albany is a grassroots, local, volunteer-led organization whose mission is to provide a forum for discussion and for sharing information on a wide variety of end-of-life issues and to advocate for the passage of medical aid in dying in New York State. We are an independent organization, but we work very closely with Compassion and Choices New York, particularly on advocacy issues, and you're going to hear quite a bit more about that in just a minute. On to our topic. You know, dying is not just a physical event. It's physical, but we're complex beings, and dying is a complex process. Medical, physical, interpersonal, societal, legal, and spiritual issues all come into play. So we're here today to talk about the spiritual aspect of dying and end-of-life issues as seen from members of 3 different faith communities. I do want to note that each of our speakers is here today, and we thank them in advance for doing that. They're here today not as officially representing their faith communities, but as an opportunity for them to share with us their own personal views on end-of-life issues based on their study and their learning over the years and their wealth of experience with these issues as well. So each panelist is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to your questions and your comments. The blank cards on your chairs are for you to write your questions or comments, and we'll come around and collect those. And let us know if you have more than one, if you need more than one card. So let me tell you who we're going to be hearing from today. Dr. David Gordis is a visiting senior scholar at the University at Albany. He served as president and professor of rabbinics at Hebrew College, and he's the founding director of the National Center on Jewish Policy Studies and the Interreligious Center on Public Life. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Columbia University, as well as a Master of Hebrew Literature and Doctor of Philosophy and Talmud degrees from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he was ordained as a rabbi in 1964. Reverend Dr. Eric Shaw has served as pastor of the Bethel Baptist Church in Troy since 2004. Reverend Shaw received his bachelor's degree from Pace University in 1990, his Master's of Divinity from the Virginia University of Lynchburg in 2006, and his Doctorate of Ministry degree from Drew University in 2013. He is currently president of the Central Hudson Baptist Association Congress of Christian Education. And Dr. William Levering is the senior pastor of the First Reformed Church of Schenectady. He earned his BA at the University of Illinois. his Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Oh, yeah.
It's been said before.
I will never live that one down. You know what I meant to say. Seminary. And his PhD from Temple University. Dr. Levering is the founder of ProClergy.com, an ad hoc group of clergy from all over the country who are in favor of the role of religious leaders in changing the world. And with deep apologies, we'll begin today with Dr. Levering. Oh, God.
Do I get 2 more minutes? Hi, my name is Bill Levering. You've heard everything about me. Don't believe half of it. I'm here to talk to you all because I am opposed to torture. I am opposed to torture in the way we treat people actively and in the way we treat people passively. I'm opposed to torturing people with pain who don't have a choice. I'm opposed to torturing people with confinement who don't have a choice. I am opposed to torturing people with humiliation who don't have a choice. And what we're gathering here is to not talk about how we are going to enforce our morality on someone else. We're gathering here to enforce a freedom from pain, a freedom from humiliation, and a freedom from unwanted restraint. And I firmly believe in these things, and I hope that you will join me in some of these. Denominations, I'm sort of in the Calvinist mainstream. I'm a Presbyterian pastor working at a Reformed church. In the Reformed church, the mainstream denominations love to put out statements. Some of them with more staff put out larger statements, and some of them with smaller staff put out smaller statements. But they all gather together to put out statements. And interestingly enough, they haven't done much in the last 20 years. Because the field has been changing a little bit and they weren't quite sure, and there's a lot of entrenchment in American Protestantism and everybody's afraid of losing a job, so statements have not come out quite as rapidly as they did at one time. But the statements as a whole are generally try to balance theology and practice. And it's common practice that has changed over the last 20 years. Medical science, we're living longer. We're able to prolong life in a different fashion than we did 20 and 30 years ago. And the practical applications of this, talk to any hospital chaplain and you will know that the practical applications of all of these theological issues has changed remarkably. So in the past, religious institutions want to say that life is sacred. Well, yeah. We all believe that. How we apply that, we're going to have difference about. And we want to enforce certain sorts of freedom about what life is sacred means. Suffering is undesirable. Now, we would all sort of say yes to that, except, there's a lot of religion that says, well, suffering produces character, and so suffering is not universal. It's another place where we're going to have different ideas about what suffering functions in the human spirit. But what we want is freedom. We say that we want to care for the powerless. Most religions champion the people who can't speak for themselves. And if you've ever been at the bottom of a medical institution that's telling you what to do, you know that that can be a very powerless situation. And so I believe that our call to support the powerless is a call to give people power and choice who operate in institutions that seem to take away power and decision from them. So we are called in our caring for the powerless to care for people who are sort of at the mercy of medical institutions, and to give doctors who who want to do differently the power of choice to give that power to their patients. Religion also has a balance between personal autonomy and what God tells us to do. Different religions are going to have slightly different approaches to how much autonomy we have and how much God is, sometimes it's called Lord. That is someone who gets to tell you what to do. And the balance between, no, I get to make this decision, and no, God really has this decision, is also something that we might debate freely. So what we're gathered here to say is we're not going to end up on any one of the sides of these issues, but we're going to defend the idea that we can come down in different places. And we're not going to legislate morality. We're going to give options to people. And these options in the states that have already done this haven't been wild revolutions. It's a couple of hundred cases, and the administration came down to a really manageable and reasonable amount of administration of this. And this has been a life-changing and pain-addressing gift of freedom. And I want to suggest to you that in all of the language that we use, that we want to respect the idea that someone's not going to agree with us, but there's going to be some middle ground. Even the statements from 20 years ago from the Reformed Church of America and the PCUSA really are sort of study guides. They're study guides to help us come to an informed conclusion on our own. My congregation, First Reformed in Schenectady, is very much concerned about what happens at the end. But it's not just one decision that you make. There's a whole portfolio of decisions that we make as we face the end. We face decisions about a living will, a DNR. We face decisions about what kind of medication. We face proxy decisions. We face decisions about what's going to happen to our organs after we die, which may affect our decisions about how we die. We're making decisions about burial, services, what hymns you want. I got a whole sheet here of which hymns you want at your funeral if you'd like to peruse this. But my point is that as we consider the whole of life, we consider the whole of death. And that it's the job of spiritual communities to help people make these decisions in such a way that they can feel whole and holy. Finally, I want to close with an anecdote about my father, which at first glance does not seem to support the cause that we are supporting. My father was, I grew up in northern Illinois, and my father was a sort of a tough guy, and he wanted to live tough his whole life. And so he carried a thing around in his billfold that says, if he ever lost any one of his senses, he wanted to be taken out back and shot. and then he lost his hearing. And so he changed it to any two senses. and then he got glaucoma. And he tore the thing up altogether. But he was making choices all along the way about how he was feeling now and how he's feeling now. And this condition changed how I feel about that. And he was looking at the end of his life and talking about his dignity. And we thought it was a holy thing. It was kind of a funny thing. But it was him getting a hold of what he wanted his life to be like. And it changed, as it always will. And the legislation that we talk about has lots of safeguards for people changing their minds. But it was an expression of who he was, which is the holiness that we are seeking to preserve. I know this is a political issue. I hope you can support the legislation, but this is also a personal issue. And I can speak for all of us up here, and that we are willing to walk with you in the journeys that we all face. And whatever those decisions are, we walk together. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. I don't have any friends. I said good afternoon, friends.
Good afternoon.
I bid you in the words of the Apostle Paul, grace, mercy, and peace be unto you. Thank you, Bonnie, for asking me to participate on today. And I give honor and respect to my colleagues in service, to Dr. Levering and Dr. Gordis. In an attempt to break the ice, at least in the Baptist tradition, it is very naive to ask a Baptist preacher to speak for just 15 minutes. But I will do my absolute best to keep to the time constraints. Friends, I simply want to share my story with you and pray that it will help further this discussion. Proud to say that I am a born-again Christian since 1995. I claim Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. I own that, and I'm righteously proud of that. I've been a pastor since 2004. And during my service as a pastor, and this is not limited to just myself, my colleagues have run across a gamut of end-of-life issues. How long do we keep our loved one on the machine? How much chemo do we administer? Even after the loved one has transitioned, what type of casket should we use? Should it be open or closed? We wrestle with these issues on a daily basis, these end-of-life issues. My doctoral work pertained to how do we minister to the community of Alzheimer's and dementia patients, as well as their caregivers. So my experience has run across many different denominations, ethnicities, etc. But beloved, nothing prepared me in my seminary work or in my service as the story I'm about to share with you regarding a 6-year-old boy. This 6-year-old boy was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2008. Once the boy's family found out he had cancer, it was well beyond stage 4. And his family got the 6 months to live speech from the staff. And 8 months later, at the age of 7, he passed away. This boy was my son. I would say regardless of how much training we have, regardless of our belief systems or lack thereof, friends, nothing prepares you for death, especially when it is a child whom you invest your aspirations and your goals and your dreams in. And I got in touch with my humanity, the pastor's hat laid to the side, my faith, beloved, I almost laid to the side behind the death of our son. So this issue of dying with dignity has become very personal for me. And I want to let you know that my family and I chose hospice care. Rather than leave our son in the hospital to expire, we chose to bring him home to die with dignity, as much dignity as there could be in dying such a slow, painful death as that. But that was our choice. And I realize, beloved, that many of you, many of your friends, etc., may exercise a different choice with regard to end-of-life decisions. So my position on today is very much similar to Dr. Levering, and I'm sure to be very similar to Dr. Gordis' position. And I believe as a community, as a religious community, we need to be present for you. I'm reminded in the Gospels of Luke, the 24th chapter. There are two men that are walking along the road of Emmaus. They are downtrodden, they are in pain, and Jesus shows up on the road, along the journey. And one thing that I take from that narrative is that Jesus did more listening than he did talking. And at the end of that exchange, beloved, those two men said, "Did not our hearts burn while he was with us?" There was a transformation, there was a change. The men were blessed by the presence of Jesus along this journey of pain. And this is where I am with regard to this issue. Regardless of who you are, ethnicity, religious denomination, or lack thereof, I want to be present. And I pray that the religious community will be present with you and with individuals that are struggling with end-of-life issues. Finally, as I close, I mentioned my son. He never complained. While the chemo was racing through his body, he never complained. While doctors poked and prodded at him, he never complained. But one day, when I had to rush him to the hospital, he said, "Daddy, do something. Daddy, do something." And I'm here today to let you know that I want to do something. And I think the best thing that we could do is to be present with you through this issue. I want to do something today. And I pray that my presence and the presence of others will bless those that are dealing with this issue. And that at the end of the road, when they've made their decision, that we can be present with them and demonstrate the love and compassion of God that will give them just that iota of peace that they're seeking along this journey. Thank you for your time, and God bless you. Beautiful.
Well, uncharacteristically, I find myself speechless. Two really remarkable presentations, both from Bill and from Eric, moving, and in substance, they really presented us with all of the issues. They really put them before us. The personal, the anguish, the pain, the uncertainty. It strikes me that considering the universality of the experience of death, the inevitability of death, the difficulty that we seem to have in talking about it together is quite striking. And when we talk about it, we often do it in a way of kind of avoiding directly the issues, of kind of hemming and hawing, elaborating the experience with all sorts of narratives which really are not helpful, and leave us in the kind of quandary that Eric shared with us in such a personal and beautiful and moving way. And I certainly join both of my colleagues in the thoughts and the sentiments and the feelings that they expressed so beautifully. After Rob Brill's piece on, and I'm so pleased that Rob is with us, the page that he put together for the Times Union on Saturday, both Bonnie and I got quite a few reactions, and the reactions were I think, by and large, very positive. My daughter, who is an academic in New York, was interested in the piece and liked it and sent it out to some of her colleagues. And she then shared with me a response that she got from a colleague of hers, a friend of hers, who was a physician. And I thought it would be interesting to read. It's a short response because it, again, it kind of complements the issues as raised by Rob and Eric, and also may help us to focus on the discussion as we move it forward. She wrote, "I would love to discuss with your dad one day This is in response to Rob Rill's piece. Given my work, I have researched this issue and have changed my opinion from a strong proponent to a cautious opponent to legalize assisted dying. My daughter, by the way, assured me that this woman is a scientist and not a crank or anything like that. So I read this with great respect, and I ask that you do too. In my experience of 16 years in palliative care practice, I have had many requests for hastened death. With each patient, support, aggressive management of anxiety and agitation, helping to find meaning, a la Viktor Frankl, that was the author of From Death Camp to Existentialism, and knowing the legal options to hasten death, withdraw or forgo certain treatments, was enough to decrease the existential suffering. It's a complex medical, ethical, and spiritual issue. End of message. So how do I react to that? How do I ask that we react to this? I think that to some extent I react the way Dr. Levering reacted to it. This scientist, obviously very sensitive and very thoughtful, was considering these notions of options, began being a strong proponent of the right of choice, the legalization of medical assistance in dying, and then she became, as she described it, a cautious opponent. And I ask myself, what is the price that's paid by that cautious opposition, and who is called upon to pay that price? She may have been struggling with the decision whether she should be on one side of the issue or on the other. But in so doing, what she was doing was actually removing what she calls the legal options to hasten death. She was claiming the authority and the right, and essentially also asserting the power to impose her cautious opposition on the person who should not have that imposed on them. This most personal moment is a moment where the question is, who should be making the decision? Let me be clear. I am not opting for anyone's choosing one form of termination of life. I'm not advocating for one or another option among the choices that should be made. I think what we are all saying is that those options should be available. The book of Ecclesiastes, which those of you who saw Rob Burrell's piece on Saturday saw that I recounted the story of my father's passing after suffering 3 years after a catastrophic stroke. He was, among other things, a very distinguished biblical scholar, and his principal works in Bible were in the wisdom literature, the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, etc. And while he was still fully in control of his powers, he would often quote to me the verse from Ecclesiastes, Ba'u yamim asher omar, eini bahem chayfetz. Days come concerning which I say, I do not want them. And it was almost prophetic in his case, because after he suffered the stroke, as I shared with Rob, and Rob shared in the story on Saturday, when I would see him and he was hardly able to speak at all, and he was suffering for this protracted period, he would say to me over and over again, David, rescue me, rescue me. And at that point, there was nothing that I could do to rescue him, but I knew very well what he was talking about. You know, in Jewish tradition, and I'm not one who pulls out Jewish tradition in order to validate the position that I have, but sometimes it is instructive. there is a difference between protracting the process, I think this is popping, it may be a little too close, between the process of protracting dying and extending living. Extending living is desirable, but once the process of dying has begun, and that can be defined in many, many different ways, it is actually prohibited by Jewish tradition to extend that process. One is not permitted, for example, to make a sound which gave the impression that a person who was in extremis and close to dying would be energized by that sound, because that would protract the process of dying. Well, I believe that, though perhaps not literally what we are talking about, certainly by application it is what we're talking about. I don't think it's an accident that the national organization, which was described for us, which I'm very supportive of, and Bonnie talked about, compassion and choices, options. We're not talking about imposing one or another option. We are saying that in this most poignant, personal moment, each of us facing death at some point in the course of our lives should have the option of choosing the sources from which we make the decisions about the quality of our end of life. Now, often, I would say most often, we don't have that option. Death often comes without the central personality being able to even think about and make those choices. So there's only a certain limited sample of cases where we have the option of making those choices. But when we are in the situation when those options are given to us, I strongly feel that a person should have the right to call on any authority, on any religious tradition, on any religious functionary that he or she wishes to shape their own perspective. But those who do not choose some religious authority, or do not choose some outside authority, but choose rather the autonomy of their own self, speaking to themselves within themselves and shaping the option that they want to choose, that should be the freedom of the individual, because ultimately the dignity of that individual relates to not losing the power to be a person, and a person can make choices. Those choices should not be imposed by political authority, by religious authority, or by any authority except those who choose and opt to submit themselves to that authority. For those who do not, that personal moment ought to be one of choice, which is available to each individual, because that's the ultimate dignity. And for those who choose to use a religious context for their argument, I simply say, it's hard for me to see how someone could believe in a God who chooses to see suffering on the part of an individual approaching dying as something which is desirable or useful or enhancing. That can't be God's will, no matter how one conceives of a God. And so for that reason, I support, along with my colleagues, the notion that the option and choices ought to be made available. Those physicians who wish to offer that kind of assistance and medical assistance in dying should be able to do so without fear, without penalty, and that's really what we're really gathered to talk about today. Thank you very much.
I feel completely inadequate following all that. Thank you so much, all three of our wonderful panelists, for thoughtful, heartfelt, thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. We're going to open it up now to your questions and comments. If you've written those on cards, will somebody, a wonderful volunteer, Amanda, collect them? While that's happening, I want to ask Nancy Willie Schiff to come up and talk about a faith community that has been supporting medical aid in dying for a surprisingly long time.
Thank you. And thank you, Lord Clergy. I understand that you're representing your own views, and I just wanted to mention that there's something called the Death with Dignity National Center. Could you speak a little louder? Can you hear?
No, it's without project a little.
Okay. There's a website for something called the Death with Dignity National Center that has a page on religion and spirituality, and it lists every denomination in the United States and the position that they take on this issue. And the only denomination that has taken a formal position in support of giving individual choice at the end of life at the national level is Unitarian Universalism. In 1988, the Unitarian Universalists voted to support a resolution and to advocate for the right of individuals to self-determination in dying and the right of terminally ill patients to select the time of their own deaths, which is essentially medical aid in dying medical assistance. So my question to clergy, given that, in terms of your own work, how do the positions of your denomination and your religion, how does that affect the work you do? And how likely is it that denominations would be neutral in a political debate so that choice could be honored for those who choose it and not limited?
Well, religion is typically
take a mic.
Really? Okay. So religion is typically opposed to sin as well. And yet, we live in certain realities in which we have to work with it, and that we have to understand it. And although we have to understand that compromises are what we live in, and that we live in an incarnation in which principles are applied in ways that we can disagree with. We may have the same principles, and the mainstream denominations have been moving in the direction of discourse, in the direction of engagement, because we don't want to say there are no principles. We don't want to say it doesn't make any difference. We don't want to say that life is worthless. But we do want to say that we're going to disagree about how these principles are applied when someone's writhing in pain, when they're going to die in 2 months, or when the specificity of the pastoral situation arises, all of a sudden things change. And no matter what denomination you are, I mean, there are in extremis situations that almost every denomination will say, well, in this case, yes, we don't have these hard, fast policies. The UUs are out ahead on this, and the rest of the denominations, as I said, have other sorts of approaches and want to keep to the middle ground. The UUs have never been in the middle ground. They have always been on the left, and the rest of us sort of swim in the middle. And they have that luxury, and so we're all swimming in that middle ground.
It sounds as if, is it Ms. Schiff? Is that the statement you just read was a statement from a religious governing body? Well, within the context of the Baptist denomination, Our church, Bethel, and many other Baptist churches in this area are organized under the National Baptist Convention of the United States. And as of today, the president of the National Baptist Convention has not published an official statement with regard to their position on this issue. With that being said, there could be in the future, once this issue reaches that level nationally, but for the most part, while many Baptist churches are organized under the NBC, in the Baptist denomination, each church is autonomous, in that while the governing body might publish an official statement as his position on any issue, the church is organized underneath that umbrella. They're not compelled to follow in line. So we are considered autonomous. So each pastor in each Baptist church would give his or her opinion to his or her local denomination. In my experience, as I mentioned earlier, I've had to wrestle with end-of-life issues concerning medication, how long do we leave our loved ones on the machines, et cetera, et cetera. And I've always positioned myself to respect the wishes of the family, because there's an element of power, and I don't use that in a negative way. When we go through sickness or any type of suffering, friends, there's a sense of a loss of power. We want to do something because this pathology, this disease has robbed us of our power. So I've always positioned myself to offer my wisdom as I feel it comes from God, and let the family make the final decision, and I would lovingly support whatever they decided to do. And what I've found is that even after, I call it the transition, after the homegoing service and the life celebration, I've often found that it draws us closer to the families that we serve, and new relationships are formed that really sustain that family for a number of years. So I hope that in some part answered your question.
Well, some of you may have noticed that the Jewish community is a small community, but a pretty fractured one, with a variety of denominations and extra-denominational groups. But one thing that unites the entire Jewish community's establishment is that there is a singular lack of courage in speaking out on significant social ethical issues. And that goes across the board from orthodoxy to conservative reform, reconstructionist, although the reconstructionists are probably closest to you in being able to speak out. So I would say that when it comes to the Jewish community, you have a kind of discontinuity between organizational leadership, it has to do with on political issues too, and rank and file of Jewish community. So it's not an accident that despite the small size of the community, individual Jews really across the country have taken extremely important active roles in such causes as death with dignity, compassion and choices, and other social ethical issues. But it's a long way from being able to rely on any of the official denominational governing bodies, either on religious or social ethical issues or on political issues. But that's a subject for another day.
Thank you. We have 3 questions that have been submitted. I'm going to do my best to read this one. Do you think a person who is beginning the path towards dementia and comes to a point where he or she is no longer able to recognize family members and does not want to live longer, should have the right to make the choice to end his or her life? This is a difficult one. Someone with dementia.
I'll go first.
You go first.
I'll do my best to answer that. One of the reasons why I chose to do my doctoral work specific to this issue of dementia is because when I became the pastor of Bethel in 2004, many of our congregants were in stages of dementia. And what I have found, and dementia is an indiscriminate disease. It affects the brain indiscriminately. So motor skills are affected, everything that the brain powers, if you will, is affected. My position on that is it needs the intervention of those that can make those rational decisions. Right now, I am ministering to a family whose mother is in close to the last stages of dementia. And as it stands now, she needs assistance in taking the medication specific to her dementia. There's a lot of confusion. You know, sometimes she'll try to take candy other than a medication because cognitively, you know, individuals that have that unfortunate condition cannot make those rational choices. So I think the person dealing with any type of dementia would need the intervention, family, doctors, etc., a well-rounded support system to assist in making that decision.
The legislation that is before New York State addresses mental competence, and you have to have somebody certify this, so it's a little bit outside the purview of what's on the table at the moment. But places like the Netherlands and there are other places in which it's handled differently. This is a tough issue. When is a dissenter decider compromised is a difficult issue. Luckily not on the table for pending legislation, but still one that moral people need to figure out what the answer to is, and that's such a sliding situation. It would be very difficult for us to make a hard, fast rule about that. I would not venture to do that.
And just if I can just jump in real quick, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And when we talk about those that are suffering with dementias, today the decision could be yes, and tomorrow it could be no. Saturday, the person may not even remember what decision they made the prior 2 days. So it's very complicated when you talk about the population that's suffering with dementia.
David, do you want to weigh in?
Both Reverend Shaw and Dr. Levering have spoken both with wisdom and experience, certainly exceeding mine.
He's such a good complimenter, isn't he? He's a fabulous.
And I fully associate myself with their responses.
The next couple of questions are really about the proposed legislation. So I'm going to ask Amanda to come up here. What positions concerning medically dying legislation have been taken or expressed by members of the New York State legislature from this area? And what positions, if any, has been taken by local hospice care providers concerning such legislation?
All right, so as far as the legislature is concerned, last year during session in May, we were able to get the bill passed through the Assembly Health Committee. That was the first time that that's happened in the years before where it's been introduced, so we were really excited about that. If we're talking about local assembly members and senators, we have seen a lot of support. They've signed, some of them have signed on as co-sponsors, but there's always more work to do, which is why we have the postcards and different things. The bill will be reintroduced in January of 2017. It will have new bill numbers, but all the bill information, the language will remain the same. We'll be having our lobby day again like we do every year, inviting people for the important votes and rallies. So it hasn't, we have a long way to go. We started, with getting the bill introduced with Senator Savino and Assemblywoman Paulin. That will remain the same, and we need more sponsors and more people involved. So sign those postcards and make sure you keep up with our emails and join us at the Capitol. As far as hospice care providers, That's a double-edged sword. The Hospice and Palliative Care Association of New York does have a formal opposition against us at this time. They do not support medical aid in dying. We hear from hospice nurses and physicians constantly that say that they are in fact supportive of the bill. So again, kind of sort of what we see in the Catholic Church, where there's a hierarchy that says that that they're against it. There's 74% of Catholics who identify as being supportive. Similar happens in the hospice care area. Dr. David Pratt is one of our biggest and loudest supporters. He's a palliative care doc, and he is very, very supportive of the cause. So it goes back and forth. We were just at a conference yesterday, and we were working alongside of a hospice and palliative care board member, and we're hopeful that someday we'll get to an agreement there. I will say that in all the other states where medical aid in dying is legal, the hospice care providers and hospice does end up going neutral. 94% of people in Oregon who use medical aid in dying are actually on hospice as well. So there is support there once the bill is passed. Then hospice kind of gives in, but they're just not there yet.
Could I ask, what are the other sources of opposition to the bill? You mentioned that the church formally, the Catholic Church is against it, and the hospice, the formal association. What are the other principal sources of opposition?
The other main source of opposition to the bill, so we have the Catholic Church and some other organized religion, but mainly it's just the Catholic Church, the Hospice and Palliative Care Association of New York overall, and lastly it would be the disability environment that I talked about earlier. The folks with disabilities, there's a group called Not Dead Yet, and some other organizations that tend to step up and say that they're very opposed to us. What we've learned in the past is that education is key for these folks. They're a very vulnerable population who is very afraid of what the bill may do to them. But there are a lot of safeguards built into the bill, and once they're educated about that, and once they know what it really entails, that opposition tends to change.
There's another one on there.
Okay, the cards, state senator, state assembly person. Okay, but there's an election going on now for the state senator. So in addition to sending to George Amador, shouldn't we send one to Sarah Colonie, who is running against him?
So right now we're going to hold on to those postcards. That's why we're just asking for your name and your address. I don't know if everybody could hear the question, but obviously it's an election year. So if we fill out the name of the senator right now, it could be different after the election.
No, I meant during the election.
Right.
Should we let her also know where we stand so she can speak out?
So we're not going to send those postcards until after the election is over. But we do have the Ask Your Candidate palm card. That's helpful, so you can talk to them about this, but we're not going to send the postcards to them until after the election's done. There's another question.
I have some questions for you all. You asked us questions, and I'm wondering if I can ask you questions. Is that okay? How many of you personally, not for any of your loved ones, how many of you personally have some notion of how you would not like to die? Oh, huh. How many of you think that you could talk to, all right, well, let's do it this way. How many of you have people that you have religious communities that you might turn to for advice about this? How many of you have religious communities? How many of you go to church? Okay, all right, okay. Do you look to us? Are we completely irrelevant? So we have something that informs you about this. So isn't that nice? We're not completely irrelevant.
Amen.
Okay. So you care about how you die, and you care about what we might say about that. Well, thank you.
Which is why it's so useful for you to be here today.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I'm also one of them. But
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Jim Miller. I was a Presbyterian executive in this area. I don't think the church has taken nearly a strong enough stand on this.
Yeah.
I think that the Protestant Jewish community has got to say, this is a religious freedom issue, and we cannot allow it to be something different than that. We need to say, this is a moral issue that each of us has the right to make a choice about. And I think we've been far too hesitant to express that as strongly as it needs to be expressed.
Thank you. Yes.
I just want to say, in response to your question, I'm a Lav Star City. And the thing is that, as you've all indicated, each of the major religions have some very different hierarchies, approach to hierarchies, and regard for those hierarchies from the local level. So there are chunks of people out there. I mean, I actually was thinking of getting back to church at some point, but I really cannot expect, with hierarchy that's in place with the RC side, to have a satisfactory answer when things get really tough. There's a big conflict between me and somebody who's responsible for me, that kind of thing.
Speaking on behalf of all ministers and rabbis and spiritual leaders every place, do not assume that they are supporting the doctrine of the hierarchy.
I know they're not, but I know there are many individuals who would not agree, but there are differences in latitude with which they can disagree.
That's also
And
true.
that's what I'm speaking to.
Yes.
Yes, I'm a Christian Catholic, and my church is very opposed, and I'm a free thinker. And I would say humbly, and I mean that, after losing my husband 10 years ago and seeing that I kept him home and didn't put him in hospice, I was able to take care of him for the 3 months till the very end, that it's a choice, and it's between you and your Lord. It isn't a hierarchy or a pope or bishops or priests who, many of them don't practice what they preach, and that's up to them. But I would like to feel there's a merciful Lord who opens his heart, and you reach out and he takes you to his heart, and you're in peace, and it's freedom.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
I really don't fit into any mold here. I am the child of a Holocaust survivor.
Could I ask you to stand up so that they can hear better?
I'm Elizabeth Shannon, Irish by marriage. I was not really raised with organized religion. My mother wrote to Viktor Frankl, and she called him her soul brother. My mother's 93, and she saw a lot of death. And she really applauds what Janet Green and I, my friend, are doing on a local level, working with Amanda, et cetera, because of the reverence for life. And that would be key. I think there's a distinction between being a spiritual individual and being one who's following a doctrine. I have a tremendous reverence for life, and when I view my mother as an amazing example of heroism, and her endorsement of this, there is, I think if you are embracing life, and I love what you said about the difference between protracted death and embracing life. So I felt very Jewish at the moment because I think that's very key. That to me, compassion has to do with an end to suffering, and that it is sinful to extend that. So I am deeply grateful to all of you for being so amazingly authentic and speaking from your hearts and souls for this cause. So thank you. I went all over the globe. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm Bob Jolinas. You know, I get very frustrated with the idea that there are two basic levels in most issues. A very complex issue, which talks about individual situations and various factors and forces and so forth. And then there's the basic cornerstone of what we're talking about. And I think if you go back to Bill's original statement about torture, do we approve of torture, of people being tortured? I don't think any of us do. Now, on the other hand, we have to ask ourselves, are people continuing to be tortured? Yes, they are. Now, we're going to allow that to continue. are we going to center in that basic commitment to stopping that? And not get lost in whether there's a big guy in the sky involved, or whether there's this or that, or whether somebody who has Alzheimer's and what degree. All that does is create, we can't see the forest for the trees. But if we can commit to the basic cornerstone issue at hand, then we can get somewhere. But almost any intellectual conversation that I hear, people start on good firm ground and then they spin off into forms of mental masturbation that absolutely frustrate all of us. So let's look at the center of this issue and make a commitment, and then we'll move.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So I would ask you, sir, respectfully, just to step into, just so I can step into your experience. What is the central issue for you? Just so I.
Torture. People are suffering. Now, I don't mean that we should impose anything on them, but we ought to give them the choice. I mean, isn't that what America itself is all about? Freedom of the individual. We're violating our own basic national standards, creed.
I could meet you there. Just as Jesus met two men on the road, I can meet you there. In a different context, in the Troy community right now, one of the diseases, and we treat it as a disease, is violence, which, in my opinion, is a form of torture. Because not only are you torturing the ones that you commit violence against, but you're also torturing the ones that are connected to that person. So I can meet you there with this. For you, it's a central issue of torture, and I could understand that. I could understand your viewpoint on that.
I understand yours as well.
Yes.
But I think, well, I don't really know your viewpoint, but I say in general we find this moving up into the more complex. Let's focus and make a commitment to the central issue at hand. I don't think we're doing that.
Thank you.
I think that it's useful to remind us of that central issue. But I do want to, for the moment, suggest why it's also necessary to deal with practical considerations. After all, the bill is a practical political question, it's a political issue. And I want to just go back for a second to this response that I got to Rob's piece. I'm sure that this scientist, this physician who wrote this piece where she changed her mind from being a strong proponent to a cautious opponent was not because she was less sensitive to matters of torture or less sensitive to the notion that people should have choice. I think she ended up on the wrong side, as I said before. But I think what she was concerned about is something which is often raised, and there are good responses to it, but it was often raised, and that is the possibilities of abuse. In other words, what I think she was really saying, that in her experience, having in the armamentarium of possible choices at the end of life, the ability to terminate life, that people might be encouraged or even induced to opt for medically assisted dying rather than trying these other routes that she was talking about. Now, I think that the problem is that she had every right and even obligation to say to people who are at end stages of life that there are these other options. But what I don't think she had the moral right to do was to preclude the option of medical assistance in dying if that person would choose it, in order to avoid the suffering, which is the key. But I don't think she was necessarily blind to the notion, because that was the reason for enthusiastic support, and I think her cautions were the possibilities of abuse. And again, just forgive me for belaboring the point, there are good responses. There are lots of things that can be subject to abuse. A driver's license can be subject to abuse. The ability to make choices in eating can be subject to abuse. lots of things. And people talk about a slippery slope. I don't buy into that. But none of those things, none of those reasons that are given are, for me, sufficiently weighty to impose on a suffering person who opts for medical assistance the inability to make the choice to get medical assistance in dying. So, I think that was important to note what some of these opponents' considerations are, not those who are simply applying doctrine from some external authority, but some real principled concerns that they may have.
I want to just shift slightly to talk about the mechanics of the bill that's been proposed, because some of you may not be as familiar about that. Thank you, Amanda, for coming back into the room just at the right time. Okay, so the medical aid in dying bill that's been proposed to the New York State Legislature proposes that a mentally competent adult who has received a diagnosis of likely having 6 months or less to live would have the right to ask their doctor for a prescription, which they would then fill themselves and take on their own, or maybe never take, but have at home ready if they choose to take it at a time when they feel that their suffering has been too great. That's basically the bill, right? So there are a couple of questions about that bill. I'll do it. And I'm going to let Amanda do this.
The first question is, why start at 18 years old? So that's what the bill proposes. That's what the bill proposes. There were originally two bills that we combined into one. One did say 21 years of age. Right now the bill states 18. We're hoping to keep it at 18, and every other state is 18. But that's what it is. Any illness, does that, I don't know who asked this question.
I think the question is, what about chronic illnesses that aren't terminal? That's what I think.
It has to be a terminal illness. So a terminal illness, by definition, is somebody who has 6 months left to live. That the definition of a terminal illness is 6 months left to live. That terminal illness, that by definition has to be confirmed by two physicians. So there will not be just one physician saying that people are terminally ill. A chronic illness sometimes can become terminal. Sometimes people can live with stage 3 cancer, for instance, and they're on a clinical trial that's working. Eventually that may stop working. They're not terminal in the beginning stages, but towards the end they could end up being terminal. When someone is given that 6-month diagnosis is when they would be eligible for medical aid in dying. And again, that has to be two doctors saying that the person is terminal.
I think the legislation is also interesting in the way it frames the words about what's happening, because the legislation very specifically says this is not suicide. Once this happens, it's not suicide. We're not using that word. We're not using that idea to talk about what it is that this is, which people have different feelings about that word than other words that we might use. And legally and insurance and all of that, it has an implication which is in the legislation.
It is, as Dr. Levering mentioned, it does specifically state this is not suicide. Suicide is a mental illness that people have, and they could go on living, but they're choosing not to, and so they take their own life. Medical aid in dying is for people who are sick. They're going to die. They're just choosing the manner in which they die. So there's a big difference between suicide and aid in dying, and we definitely stay far away from that word. I just want to answer this last question. Is this on the ballot this year? New York is not a ballot state. We are not allowed to put things on the ballot. So no, it is not on the ballot. We have to make it through the legislature. Yes?
I just have one question about how the bill would work. Thinking from the point of view of somebody who's a hospice care provider, somebody's at home,
and they're doing their hospice there. They make the decision, say the bill passes, they make the decision, they get the dose. I sat in chemotherapy wards and watched nurses have to deal with I'll stand up. I sat in chemotherapy wards and watched the nurses there, God bless them, have to deal with a patient who was clearly at or beyond the end of their rope and were very fogged up from all the chemo and was essentially being forced through treatment by their daughter, their son, other members of their family. In states where they have been able to pass this, where the hospice, and that would, if they take the dose, they come home, I can see the poor hospice provider, that nurse, being in a horrible position if that all blows up after somebody, say, takes the dose. So in states where they have gone neutral, have the hospice organizations asked for extra legal protections for their own people?
No, not that I'm familiar with. Just a little bit of clarification. This is a personal choice, so this is a thought out process. Generally in Oregon, it's a median of 41 days. So this isn't you go to the doctor's office and get an injection. This is a self-ingested medication that you have to drink at home.
Yep.
So this issue doesn't really arise, I guess. People are home comfortable with the people who are supporting their choice. People who may not be supportive probably aren't around during this process.
What I thought, Amanda, in the law that it doesn't have to be a doctor.
Couldn't hear you.
It doesn't have to be a doctor. It's two people. It can be a family member, or it can be a family member or no, also a friend, but it doesn't have to be a doctor. It doesn't have to be a hospice. It's a person that's going to be giving the medication to themselves.
So 2 doctors have to confirm that the person is terminal before the medication is prescribed. So 2 doctors have to confirm the diagnosis. 2 people have to witness that the person is asking for the medication, not a family member that's going to benefit from the person's life insurance policy. When they're home and they're going to ingest the medication, they can have people present or they don't have to. There's no requirement. Once the person's prescribed the medication and gets it, there's no further requirements after that about who has to or doesn't have to be there.
I saw the movie recently and it was very good.
How to Die in Oregon? Yeah, if anybody has not seen the movie How to Die in Oregon, it's on Netflix and Amazon Prime and YouTube. Definitely take a couple hours out of your day to watch it. It really walks through the process of aid in dying, how it works, and what happens. It's really great.
Amanda, just to clarify to your point on the hospice nurse, all medical professional and family members have immunity in terms of criminal procedure. No problem.
Any other questions?
Wait, somebody back
Go
here.
ahead.
Oh.
Glenn.
Oh, I was here to answer the point, but I just wanted to say that, all of the current statutes around the country and New York's proposed statute all provide immunity to physicians, pharmacists, witnesses, anybody else involved with or witnessing the act of the person ending their life. So, that's built into the statutes. There's also language built in there that says it can't affect any health insurance premiums or benefits. New York statute says it can't impact life insurance premiums or benefits. It can't impact the professional liability insurance application or premiums or consequences. It can't affect the doctors or pharmacists licensing and so forth. So New York's proposed statute, as it currently stands, it's not law, but it's proposed, has all those protections for everybody involved.
Thank you.
I know we've gotten a little bit away from the topic and into the mechanics of the law, but it just seems like people have so many questions about the law and how it works, and it just felt like this was a good opportunity to answer some of your questions about the mechanics of the law. One last question about that part?
Yes, please. So when you have lobbied about this in the past, what kinds of objections have you heard from legislators, and how has that gone?
A lot of the question was, when we've lobbied in the past, what kinds of objections have we heard from legislators? A lot of the objections are the kinds of things that Amanda had mentioned before. People worried, concerned that vulnerable people might be taken advantage of. And what we say to them is that we understand that concern. There are many, many safeguards built into the bill that are intended to avoid a disabled person or a person who is vulnerable in some way, to avoid being taken advantage of. And what we've found in the states where this has been legal, for instance in Oregon, which has over 19 years of experience now, which is carefully documented, is that the bill works exactly as it's intended, and that there is no abuse. There's been no evidence in all these years of the abuse of people who might be vulnerable.
I would just want to add to that, Ronnie, that, number one, disability has not ever been a terminal illness. So you would never get a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live.
Yeah.
And that the Independent Living Resources, which is a large disability organization in Utica, has endorsed us and is very supportive of us and is attending our lobby days. So it's not a widespread opposition of the disability.
Thank you. There was one more I wanted to catch. Yes.
I know it says 18 or over. My question is, they approved marijuana for children that are suffering with diseases. Why won't they approve something like this for a child like yourself that is eventually...
The question is why 18? Why not younger children? And I think the assumption is that a younger child may not have the maturity and the wherewithal to make that decision for themselves.
I mean, for parents to have the right to be able to say, child only has a month left to live, to save them all that heartache of going through needles and, attachments on.
The moral character of the question changes remarkably if you're making a decision for somebody else. No matter how old they are, no matter what situation they're in, even if you're the parent, if you're making this kind of decision, the moral texture changes dramatically.
This is about an autonomous piece of legislation. It's very much about the autonomy of the individual, which is why it's so very clearly laid out in the legislation that this be self-administered. It does mean that there are some disease states that will not be allowed to participate in the legislation, which is in some ways unfortunate, that things like Huntington disease, because by the time you get a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live, you can no longer self-administer. But it's really important to all of our organizations that support this that people be very autonomous in their decisions. So children would not be able to be autonomous in that decision-making process.
Once on your driver's license, you can choose or not choose to donate an organ in the event you're in a car accident. And for another situation they were talking about, on your driver's license, why can't they have that, a similar type of thing, that in the event I develop dementia when I get to a certain point, I want somebody to help and assist me because I don't want to live that way. With Alzheimer's, all kinds of illnesses that you can't have a legal document.
You need to speak up.
Maybe you can repeat the question.
Yeah, what she's asking is why can't we have sort of a checkoff like we do on a driver's license that says that you can donate your organs? Why can't you have a checkoff on your driver's license that says, should I become ill with dementia or Alzheimer's or something where I'm mentally incapacitated, that I choose to want to take this medication and utilize this legislation? And what I would say to you, having been in this industry for 18 years in New York State, is, everything starts with a half a loaf. And so we in New York are in many ways a very protective state of our people that live here, and so we want to make sure that this is a very tightly controlled piece of legislation, and we know from experience in 18 years, 19 years now in Oregon what works, and so we are modeling things after states with experience, and we know
Thank you so much, Lisa. So Lisa Reed works with Compassion and Choices and Death with Dignity-Albany at the Capitol. She is our lobbyist, so she has more knowledge probably than anybody in this room about the specifics of the bill, so thank you. I just want to add in that Compassion and Choices not only advocates for medical aid in dying, but we also advocate for a variety of bills across the country to make end-of-life care better. One of those laws that is currently pending on a federal level is the dementia provision. And Luke Piero, an attorney, will be here to talk about all those sorts of different documents and things that you can fill out in a couple weeks on October 25th. So certainly come back if you have specific questions like that, but the dementia provision is something that you can fill out when you're filling out your power of attorney and things that says, if I have dementia and I can't recognize my daughter, I no longer want to be tube fed. If I have dementia and I can't tie my shoes by myself, please don't give me any more life-sustaining measures. So that's something that Compassion and Choices worked really hard on a federal level, and that is very active and possible. So there are ways for people with dementia and Alzheimer's that we are trying to make life a little better.
Thank you.
I'd like to also talk about the larger issue of freedom that this is an expression of. So we are trying to respect everyone's freedom and have dignity for all people in their self-determination. That has to do with how we die, it has to do with how we dress, it has to do with all kinds of things. And in a society which at the moment seems to be closing down on our judgments about how that works, we need to understand this to be an expression of a larger sense of freedom and dignity that in America we need to stand up for on a continuing basis.
So, underlying a lot of the comments and questions that you've brought up is the issue of conveying your wishes and your preferences to your loved ones so they know what you would want. And this is also a cause that we have pursued, we feel very strongly about. And to try to tie this point into the spiritual nature of the topic we've been talking about, I want you to know about an organization out of Boston called the Conversation Project. Their mission is to help people have the conversation with their loved ones, to talk about what they do and don't want at the end of their lives, how to make decisions, what they would wish for in terms of making decisions if they're no longer able to communicate themselves. It's really important for you, for all of us, to try to figure out those choices, the things that you would want, and commit them to writing in legal documents, and then that isn't enough. You have to communicate those to your loved ones so that they know what you would want if you can't speak for yourself. The spiritual link to this is that the Conversation Project for the second year is encouraging congregations around the country to hold a Conversation Sabbath. It's in November, and what they're proposing is that the clergy members would preach or teach about the importance of having the conversation, and would focus on that. And the Conversation Project has a lot of materials on their website that are supportive, that can guide people through this. They have a starter kit that's available to be downloaded. It's a wonderful resource, and it's the spiritual link that we've been talking about now in terms of following through, making sure that your loved ones can follow through on your own wishes.
I'd also recommend that you file these pieces of paper that you come up with your longitudinal relationships. If that's your synagogue, that you go to your rabbi and say, here's what I've decided, because they might be in the mix too, and at some point a family member is going to turn to the spiritual leader, and what they say might be significant. So you file it with the people who you have longitudinal relationships with, and they might be able to enforce it better than a confused family member at any given moment.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes?
I think most of us in this room have heard the term good death. Is there such a thing? Is that something that Death with Dignity or Compassion and Choices or people from the spiritual community hear or acknowledge or want to talk about?
I think everybody probably has their own definition of that, a good death. It's very personal, isn't it? And as you said before, it might change from yesterday to today.
Well, if I can just draw on the experience that we had with our son and on my personal beliefs in the Lord, the only thing good about death is that it leads us to the afterlife or to heaven. For me, that was the only good thing about our son transitioning, is that my faith lets me know that there is an eternal life after this one. And that's the thing that's good. That's the only, if something good can be said about death here, is that it leads us to life with God.
Dr. Gordis? Yes.
Yeah. What's always puzzling to me is that death is looked upon with such dread. Why psychologically do we dread it? I know some have invested their concern into a belief in a narrative of an afterlife. Others don't choose to do that. But I think the reason why we look upon it with dread is, first of all, there is an anticipation of the likely suffering and pain that we go through in the process of dying. That's one reason why we look upon it with such apprehensiveness and such fear. The other is that it's very hard to conceive of a world in which we are not a player. The world without us is a frightening kind of prospect. And so that's a second reason for why we look upon death as something which is such a negative thing. The other kind of thing is the fact that we always feel, or generally people feel, that we've died prematurely. There's so many other things that we want to do in life that we haven't gotten to. There's an old Jewish statement in rabbinic law, Ein Adam Meit B'chatzi Tavato Biado. No one dies having achieved even half of what he or she aspires to. And to some extent that there is truth to that we always want to do more. And yet, we really need to realize that death, it's not only necessary, but it's good. If there were no death, life couldn't go on earth. There have to be the opportunities for the next generations to take their place. If one chooses to buy into a traditional narrative of the afterlife, that's one way of dealing with it. If not, one has to deal with the sense that we've had our time on earth, we've done what we could have done, we live on in the influence that we have on others and the connections we have with others and the impact we've had on the world, hopefully for the good. And it's natural and good and appropriate that that comes to an end and place is made for the next generations. With the hope, we hope that they'll do a better job than we did with this world. But I think there has to be at least the beginning. That's why I mentioned before that we do so badly in talking about death. And part of it is this notion of this how bad it is, but it isn't bad. It's part of the life cycle. It's inevitable. It's necessary for the world. If one believes as a traditionalist that it's part of God's plan, then we are born and we die. Right? As again, the same ecclesiastic. There's a time to be born and a time to die. Eit laledet ve'eit lamut. So we have to, I hope that there'll be a kind of a tipping point when the kind of conversations that Bonnie talked about, the kind of conversation we're having today, will lead us to start doing better in how we both think of death, how we plan for death, and how we can talk more openly about it in the knowledge that that's what life is. If there were no death for us, there would be no life for someone else. If there were no life for us, there would be no death. So we need to find to transcend this narrative, forgive me, I call it the doom and gloom narrative. Because Of course, they're sad. There's sadness, there's loneliness, there's often decline. But there's the other side of it, is not only the inevitability, but the necessity of it. And again, if one wants to use a traditional narrative, that's part of God's plan.
And I'll tell you a story that is a personal narrative, and I'll try to take all theology out of it, although I'm sure some's going to sneak in. So about 40 years ago,
you should lift it at 30.
30 years ago, I was administered a drug in circumstances that doesn't matter, but it was a legal drug, and I had a dramatic allergic reaction to this drug. And my blood pressure dropped out of sight, and they couldn't find a pulse, and the alarms went off, they say, and I had that experience that you read about. I had the out-of-body experience. I was up in the corner of the room looking down on all this action, and I don't know how close I was to death. I think I was pretty close. I don't talk about this a lot. You get to hear this. So I was probably as close to death as we can get. I remember I had to decide to live. I said, I think I'll live. But it was very, very casual, and I have to tell you, it was very peaceful. And it is not something I fear anymore.
Amen.
We don't have to be afraid of death and rush away from it. Neither shall we rush into the arms of death. But it is not something to be deathly afraid of.
I think that's a wonderful way to end our meeting today. I want to thank deep thanks to all three.
Good job. Good job.